Hello, and thanks for joining me for another episode of Lights Out, brought to you from across the pond. I'm your hostess with the mostest ghosties, Sylvia Schultz. In the long history of London, there were few times quite as terrifying as the 8 months of the Blitz from September 1940 to May 1941. Coming from the German Blitzkrieg, meaning lightning war, the Blitz was a German bombing campaign against the United Kingdom. More than 40,000 civilians were killed by Luftwaffe bombing. London was hit especially hard. Over 1 million homes were destroyed or damaged. Let's visit one of the places where people sought shelter from the devastation, with unforeseen results. Draw your blackout curtains as we go Lights Out. London today is a bustling city as it was in the days of World War II. You'd think that, modern progress being what it is, many people would have moved on from the memories of those dark days. Or maybe that's just my American privilege talking. On the contrary, the British have not forgotten that part of their history. Even our host, Paul Adams, had a family story regarding the war. On our drive to visit Kew Gardens, we passed a cinema. Paul pointed it out to us and told us that his parents were there for a Sunday afternoon matinee. As they were coming out, German bombs started falling. They had to shelter in the doorway of the theater from the shrapnel falling all around them. On one of our London days, Paul, Dale, and I visited the Queen's House. Not, Buckingham Palace, but another big white palace in the middle of the city. We were there to see the Tulip Staircase, site of a very famous ghost photograph by the Reverend Hardy. The photo shows a shadowy, monk-like figure going up the stairs. I tell you, there is nothing quite like seeing a picture your whole life than seeing that place in real life. It's amazing. After taking a few pictures of our own, we started walking back to the tube station that would take us back to Luton and Paul's house. As we walked, I mentioned just offhand that Londoners must have been very comforted to know that they had the London Underground tunnels to shelter in during the Blitz. Paul said that yes, actually, people were very grateful for that source of safe shelter, because some of the tube lines are quite deep underground. Then he reminded me about the Bethnal Green disaster. I immediately asked if we could visit that station, and he said of course we could. I remembered this tragic story from the research I did for my book Days of the Dead, A Year of True Ghost Stories. Bethnal Green Tube Station was the site of the worst civilian disaster of the Second World War. Londoners during the Blitz really learned the meaning of keep calm and carry on. The Luftwaffe carried out nighttime bombing raids on London and other British cities from September 1940 to May 1941. The raids caused enormous destruction of property, and casualties were severe. Some 43,000 British civilians were killed, and another 139,000 were wounded. London was pounded for 76 nights in a row, enough to wear down anyone's nerves. But the British people were unbowed. During the second month of the Blitz, Princess Elizabeth addressed the nation. The clear, piping voice of the 14-year-old princess came over the airwaves, reassuring her people that she shared their pain. "We are trying, too, to bear our share of the danger and sadness of war," she said. "We know, every one of us, that in the end all will be well." Londoners, especially, tried to make the best of the situation. The government allowed people to use the underground system as air raid shelters, a decision that saved thousands of lives. People put children to bed in hammocks suspended between the tracks. They passed around cups of tea and sang songs to keep their spirits up. But one night in March 1943, tragedy struck the Bethnal Green Tube Station. The horrors of the Blitz had begun to fade. Britain's darkest hour was a couple of years past. But the skies still held the possibility of danger. Earlier, Allied planes had bombed Berlin, and they'd done a thorough job. Londoners were understandably nervous. German bombers had been concentrating on Russia, but that could change. Around 8:30 on the night of March 3rd, an air raid siren wailed a warning. Hundreds of people headed for the Bethnal Green station, not yet operational. Anti-aircraft artillery in nearby Victoria Park began launching rockets, but here's the thing. A shell headed up sounds an awful lot like a shell headed down. About 1,500 people had made it to safety underground, but there were about 300 people crowded on the sidewalk when a cry went up, "It's a bomb!" Rain had made the 19 steps to the bottom slick, and the only light came from a dim 25-watt bulb. To their credit, people tried not to panic, tried to make their way down the treacherous steps in an orderly fashion. But 3 steps from the bottom, a woman carrying her young child lost her footing and fell. An elderly man stumbled and fell on top of the 2. No one could see much of anything, so those in the back of the crush didn't see any reason not to keep pressing forward. Within 15 seconds, the crowd of people had surged forward into a death trap, suffocating 173 people in the narrow stairwell. The victims were overwhelmingly women and children. Some of the bodies were so badly mangled they had to be identified by their clothing. All of them were a sickly shade of purple from the asphyxiation. The government suppressed the story. There had been no air raid and no bombs had been dropped. But 173 people, 62 of them children, had been killed in a panicked stampede. Authorities felt that the truth would be a blow to morale, so they leaned on newspapers to report that the casualties were a result of the direct hit by the Luftwaffe. 50 years later, a memorial plaque was installed at the Bethnal Green station. In December 2017, the Stairway to Heaven Memorial was unveiled. It's a full-sized replica of the fatal staircase, with the names of the victims carved into the teak wood of each step. But the victims of the tragedy don't seem to be satisfied with the memorial, beautiful though it is. Workers at the station have reported hearing children sobbing, women screaming, and sounds of mass panic. The sounds start quietly at first, then rise to a crescendo of terror. Quite the unsettling experience late at night in an empty station. The Bethnal Green Monument is at the entrance to a pretty little park. There's a dark plaque affixed to the lintel over the entrance to the station, but the memorial is much nicer. I didn't realize this, but there are bronze markers on the white base, and those markers are memories of survivors. The whole thing was very moving. I looked at the stairwell, which now does have a handrail down the middle, and I tried to imagine 300 people in that small area. I am standing at the Bethnal Green Tube Shelter Disaster Memorial. I am going to read for you the plaque that is here at the memorial. On 3rd March 1943, the air raid warning sounded at 8:17 p.m. People made their way in the pitch dark of the blackout to file in an orderly manner down the steps of the single entrance to the unfinished Bethnal Green underground station next to this memorial. It had been in regular use since 1940 as a deep air raid shelter. Over the next 10 minutes, local pubs and cinemas emptied so that some 2,000 people were already in the shelter by 8:27 p.m. when the searchlight went on. Those still waiting to enter were alarmed by the deafening sound of a new anti-aircraft rocket battery opening fire for the first time nearby. They assumed it to be enemy bombs falling. At that time, 3 buses set down their passengers at the unsupervised shelter entrance. The crowd hurried down the poorly lit 10-foot-wide first flight of 19 concrete steps, which had no central handrail. On this wet, slippery stairway, a woman with a child fell on the 3rd step from the bottom, and others tumbled over her. The crowd above continued pressing forward, unable to see the horror of what was happening below. Within seconds, the whole staircase was a solid, tangled mass of 300 people trapped 5 or 6 deep. Despite heroic efforts, rescuers working above and below found it difficult to release them before they suffocated in the crush. It was 11:40 p.m. before the last of the total 173 dead was pulled out: 84 women, 62 children, and 27 men. 62 people were hospitalized, and at least 30 more walked away wounded. Many more suffered lifelong trauma. This was the worst civilian disaster of the Second World War. This is an amazing, touching memorial. The title of the memorial is Stairway to Heaven. And there's actually a Bethnal Green Shelter Disaster Memoryscape audio trail. A free audio trail featuring the memories of witnesses to the 1943 Bethnal Green Shelter disaster is available from bgmemorial.org.uk/audio. So, yeah, check that out if you want to. The memorial is a big white concrete slab, and there are memories of people that were involved in this disaster inlaid in brass on the concrete. I put my hands together and crouched on my hands and knees with a small gap of air to breathe through. My sister Iris and cousin Barbara Land were trapped standing nearby. Barbara could only be identified by her shoes. When my mother died recently, we found Iris's coat from that night in her wardrobe. She had kept it all those years. Peter Parament, survivor. Jean McGuire. Mum refused to let Jean visit our aunt and uncle that night, but she kept badgering until Mum gave in. That was the last time she saw Jean. My father never spoke again to my aunt and uncle because they were in the shelter with her, and they survived, but Jean didn't. June Blackman, sister. George and Doris Newman. All I remember is the 4 of us being pushed up against the right-hand side of the wall. Then nothing until morning. My dad, George Newman, and my sister Doris, 9, died together. They idolized each other, and he would never have coped if he had survived without her. Louisa Tyrer, survivor. My mother, Ellen Ridgway, was trapped in the crush, and her last act was to ensure my safety. She held me aloft above the crush so that a policeman could reach out and grab me. I was the youngest survivor, but the emptiness of not having a mother's love and guidance will never leave me. Margaret McKay, survivor. Sorry, guys. This is really affecting. We just missed the first bus. As we entered the shelter, I remember tripping over something, but my sister grabbed me. Eventually, we were pulled out. My 16-year-old sister had to walk into a room full of dead bodies looking for Mum, but thankfully she was later found alive. If we hadn't missed that bus, we would all have been dead. Babette Clark, survivor. Annie Dongray had only recently been married to a soldier, and they just managed to have one weekend together before her husband had to return to the war. After the disaster, he was allowed home and insisted that his new wife was buried in her wedding dress. Lorraine Yalland, niece. 7 members of the Meade family, George Sr., Florence, George Jr., Kenneth, Maureen, Eliza, and her married daughter, Matilda Karabanek, were caught up in the disaster. 6 died in the crush. Maureen, 4, was pulled out alive, but sadly died hours later in the hospital with a tear in her eye. Lorraine Smith, great niece. The emergency services worked heroically, pulling free the living and the dead, not knowing if their own family or friends would be among them. At the scene were police, fire, medical, and ambulance services, air raid wardens, heavy rescue squad, scouts, and others. Rescuers included P.S. Richard Sherrick, Fireman Henry Ackland, Messenger Boy Jimmy Hunt, Dr. H. Yarrow, Home Guard Bob Saxon, and many more. All were affected by the dreadful experiences. Rose, Doreen, and Ronald Collett. I only know the effect the deaths of my grandmother Rose and her son Ron, 8, and daughter Doreen, 10, had on my mother and her other brothers and sisters. It was far too painful to remember, so they blocked it out and would not talk about it. Chris Foley, granddaughter. My mum, Ivy Brind, was pushed down the stairs and landed on her back, holding her 2-year-old nephew, Barry Seabrook, in her arms. She tried to protect him by holding her arms above him, but the weight of so many people falling on them became too great. Next morning she found that her mum had also died in the crush. She heard the screams and cries every night thereafter. Sandra Scotting, daughter. Mary Stevens, formerly Scotcher and recently remarried, said, "If anyone's to go in this war, let it be me." She got her wish. She went to the shelter with her youngest son John, who was on leave, and his wife Eva. Mary died, but they survived along with the rest of her family. Anna Reed, great-granddaughter. I was on duty at the Children's Hospital on Hackney Road through the night when the adult casualties started to arrive. They were all dead, but wet, as the medics had tried to revive them with water. We were sworn to secrecy, and it was incredible that we obeyed. It was the worst night of my medical career. Dr. Joan Martin, MBE, hospital doctor. May Hutchinson was brought out alive by her husband, a stretcher bearer, but her children Joan and William were not so lucky. My sister could not live with the loss of her children and took her own life soon after. Tom Moss, brother. I was trapped on the 3rd stair from the bottom, shouting for help. Air raid warden Mrs. Chumbley grabbed me by my hair, then under my arms. She finally pulled me free. My aunt, Lillian Hall, came down to the bunks a little later, tattered and bruised. As instructed, we said nothing to anyone all night. Alf Morris, survivor. I was informed of serious trouble at the shelter. A solid mass of about 300 persons were wedged 5 or 6 deep in a space of about 13 feet by 10 feet. It took seconds from the first person falling. I ordered the rescue of casualties from below at around 9 p.m. There was no panic. The blockage was finally cleared at 11:40 p.m., but doctors and ambulance parties were still on the scene. Police Inspector Albert Ferguson. Thanks for coming along with me for a walk around the Stairway to Heaven. Join me next time for a visit to the Hellfire Caves with a very special guide. Stay tuned for the next time we go Lights Out.